This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Links to learn more about our guest today can be found in the show notes. You can support Beyond the Big Screen on Patreon.com. By joining on Patreon, you help keep Beyond the Big Screen sustainable and get many great benefits. Go to patreon.com/Beyond the Big Screen to learn more and sign up. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go beyond the big screen.
Welcome back to another episode of Beyond the Big Screen. We are joined yet again by our good buddy Josh Cohen, host of the Eyewitness History podcast. Now, depending on when you listen to the episodes, you probably have heard Josh talk about some of Quentin Tarantino's movies. Today, we're going to do something a little bit differently. We're going to take a look at our list. We both came up with lists of underrated movies. So I think, and we would definitely love to hear what your underrated movies are. But in the meantime, since Josh has been on the podcast for the last time, he has started his own podcast on the Parthenon Podcast Network, and it's called Eyewitness History. And Josh, why don't you tell us a little bit about Eyewitness History?
Absolutely. Well, first off, thanks again for having me, Steve. It's always a pleasure to see you, and it's always a pleasure to talk film. One of my other great loves, in addition to history. So the Eyewitness History podcast, which we started about maybe 3 months ago, it's really taken off. It's been wonderful. I've had the honor and privilege of hearing phenomenal stories from phenomenal people. As you all know, I had the distinct honor of interviewing a Holocaust survivor, who I had him on for 2 episodes, one discussing his time at Auschwitz, and then a second one where he describes his liberation. A pretty phenomenal story. I've been able to speak with Vietnam War veterans. I spoke with Jan Scruggs, the creator of the Vietnam Memorial Wall, and we discussed what that was like for him and the struggles that he had. Far too many to list, but just to say it's been an incredible ride, and we're just going to keep getting bigger and better. And I would really encourage all your listeners, Steve, to take a look at the Parthenon Podcast Network's Eyewitness History, hosted by Josh Cohen. So how's that for my intro?
That's an excellent intro. And I think people should definitely, the Vietnam veteran you interviewed, I personally enjoy hearing these stories of its history through the people who actually made history. Isn't that something close to your tagline?
Very much so. Yeah. It's something along the lines of, through the eyes of the people that watch the events that shaped our world.
Yeah.
Hearing people, like I say, give their eyewitness accounts of what it was like in Vietnam, as you point out, what it was like on stage with Queen at Live Aid. I had the pleasure of speaking with the unofficial 5th member of Queen, Spike Edney, in an interview that I was very privileged to have done as well. So it's been great, and I hope to keep going.
Now, today, like I said a little bit earlier, not to repeat myself, but a little bit at least, we're going to talk about underrated films. And that's a really interesting topic. To you, Josh, what qualifies something as an underrated film?
Well, there's first going to be the obvious financial question. There'll be movies like some of the movies I'm going to discuss that I picked that have phenomenal everything, great acting, phenomenal screenwriting, great directing, and so forth. But for whatever reason, it doesn't catch on in the culture. It doesn't catch fire. It's red meat that the pooches don't go for at the box office. So that is one way to define it. Another way would just, from an artistic sense, is to watch the movie and just believe that it's something that's being underappreciated. There's a movie that it's not included on my list at the moment, but it just strikes me as you asked me that question, called Mr. Megorium's Wonder Emporium, which was Yeah, which I believe was Heath Ledger's last movie. And it has the interesting distinction of since he died while they were filming, they had to get a bunch of other actors, including Johnny Depp and Colin Farrell, to basically fill in his role. If you watch the movie, it makes perfect sense, and it makes a degree of sense. But that's a great example of something that I would consider to be underrated, but still phenomenally well done.
So we're going to start out with these are in no particular order, but we're going to start out with Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, which was the first movie that you proposed, or at least the first on your list. Tell us a little bit about Kiss Kiss Bang Bang for those who maybe haven't seen it.
Yeah, so Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, for people that aren't familiar with it came out in 2005, starring Robert Downey Jr. when he was just on the way back after achieving what has now turned out to be his lasting sobriety. Robert Downey Jr. along with Val Kilmer, who of course people will know from films like Top Gun and so forth, and Michelle Monaghan as well, who would later play Robert Downey Jr.'s wife in the movie Due Date, directed by Todd Phillips, 2008. It's sort of a genre bending movie. So basically the premise is Robert Downey Jr. plays a thief, a burglar who's on the lam and is chased into this film audition. The cops are chasing him, and he stumbles into this film audition, and he's all emotionally distraught because he just saw his partner get killed. And the people in the audition have him do the reading, and the character in the screenplay that he's reading from just loses his partner. So he gets what could be called, I suppose, a callback, and he's flown out to Los Angeles under this guise of being a supposed actor, where he's teamed up with a private detective played by Val Kilmer to supposedly research for this role of the detective. And in doing so, he stumbles across I don't want to give too much away, but he stumbles across a real true blue murder case, which because he fancies the woman who brings him the case, Michelle Monaghan, he says that he's a true, real private detective and takes the case. Hopefully that wasn't too jumbled there. Great movie with great acting and phenomenal chemistry by both Iron Man and Batman, Val Kilmer and Robert Downey Jr. I think one of the reasons, since this might be a fun place to explore, I think one of the reasons why it perhaps didn't catch on right away is because it is genre bending, and sometimes movies that you can't really fit into a specific category tend to maybe not do so well. One fun note here: it's directed by Shane Black, who movie fans will know as the director of all the Lethal Weapon movies, and is also the director of Iron Man 3, of all things.
Yeah, I found movies like that. Well, first with this one, I think in this movie we'll try, or in this episode at least, we'll try to avoid some spoilers. Some of the episodes, or some of the movies that we'll come up with and discuss on this, we may have episodes in the future of, but at this point in this episode, we'll keep the spoilers to a minimum so that people can kind of go and enjoy them and see if they think they're underrated. But to your point, I think that a lot of times movies that don't naturally fit into a certain pigeonhole, they can get lost, and people, if they just don't get them on that first blush of watching it, they're not going to go back and revisit them. And this seems like a movie that it has an interesting plot line to it that I think you would have to watch 2 or 3 times maybe to really try and get it.
Yeah, I agree. The way the story is presented is I don't want to say confusing, but it is slightly intellectual in that sense. I want to just say again, the chemistry between Robert Downey Jr. and Val Kilmer, in my opinion, and I'm glad I'm on a podcast to say this because I've been saying it for years. In my opinion, every bit as good as Downey's and Jude Law in Sherlock Holmes. I can't. I especially like dialogue where I can't tell which bits have been improvised and which bits haven't. I can almost guarantee that, mostly because it's Downey, that a good bit of their dialogue was improvised by him and them. But yeah, great movie, great screenplay, awesome dialogue. It's developed a slight bit of a cult following because, as I mentioned, it was I think the second film. I may be wrong. Maybe our listeners can fact check me. I believe it was the second film Robert Downey Jr. did after he achieved sobriety. The first he did, I think, was The Singing Detective, directed by Mel Gibson. And so, well, put it this way, Robert Downey Jr.'s star power isn't what it is today. If the movie was released today, I am certain it would, do just fine. And then just sorry to drone on, Steve, but but just for my last bit, just to give our audience context, the film was made on a $15 million budget, and it brought in a whopping 15.8 million. And theaters, so distributors, will generally take about half of what the gross is from the box office. So if you want to look at it that way, and in terms of functionality, it functionally operated at a loss.
My first movie that I'm going to present as underrated is the movie American Made from 2017. And I don't love Tom Cruise. I mean, Tom Cruise is almost for me an airline movie. If you're on a long flight and there's a Tom Cruise movie, all right, I'll watch it. I did an episode on this one a couple of years ago with another podcaster, Prof. CJ, and when I asked him if there was a movie he wanted to talk about, he was like, boom, American Made. And I watched it and I absolutely loved this movie. And it's on a topic, and that's to me why I think it's underrated, it did okay at the box office. It was nothing stunning. It had a $50 million budget and it made 134 million. So in that way, it really wasn't underrated. But I think in my estimation of why it was underrated is that it tackled such a interesting part of history that nobody really talks about. And I think it was really bold to talk about this semi-fictionalized story of a person who was importing drugs from, I believe it was Pablo Escobar in Colombia, into the United States with the help of the CIA. And with they brought in, he was doing it. He was based out of Mena, Arkansas. So anybody who's into conspiracy theories and all of that, you'll know Mena, Arkansas.
Just like a mutual friend, Richard Lim. Sorry,
yeah. If you're into all of that, the fact that this movie tackled that kind of in the guise of just a regular action biopic kind of movie, but all these undercurrents of things that really happened that were really shady with the US government and with drugs and Iran Contra and all of these things that were so bubbling up in the late 80s, early 90s, and to put this into a film that was really just packaged as a pretty straightforward action film, I think they did it fantastically.
Well, that's really interesting. Yeah, when he said American Made, I was a little skeptical because my first thought was, how is Steve gonna convince me that Tom Cruise is underrated? But yeah, as you're talking, it's interesting subject matter. It's a bit esoteric, which coincidentally I actually feel similar to you about Tom Cruise. He's hit and miss, to put it mildly, for me. But one thing that's undeniable is, boy, can he act. And this was a great movie. I think I agree. I really love the subject matter of it. The fact that they tackled something that I wasn't aware of. I knew, we know these words: Iran Contra affair in Nicaragua and Pablo Escobar and etc. But to see it all played out, no spoilers. But yes, to see it all played out, I think I agree with you. What? Try it again. Why would you classify the movie as underrated? Just so I'm clear.
I think for me, even though it didn't get huge attention for what it was really trying to do. I think most people and the critics really just saw it as a Tom Cruise action movie, kind of Mission Impossible-y. Even if you look at the cover art for it, it just looks like another standard fare Tom Cruise movie, maybe with a little with the drug element. I don't think it was ever billed as something that was way outside of the norm. But I think that in the way that it's underrated is that it's underrated in that it really nailed perfectly, and at least in a fictionalized version of a piece of really important history, and it wasn't billed that way at all.
Yeah, I'm with you. It was marketed as it's just Ethan Hawke going by a different name, and sort of negating the historical significance of it. Yeah, I think I'm with you. I agree.
All right, let's take a look at your next one. So, this was a really interesting one. Death to Smoochie. I was shocked when I saw that one. I'm going to be honest.
Death to Smoochie, one of my all-time favorite movies. I really do think it's one of the funniest movies ever made. So Death to Smoochie, for people that aren't aware, it came out in 2002. And a really phenomenal cast. I mean, you have Robin Williams, you have Edward Norton, you have the great Catherine Keener, you have Jon Stewart, you have Harvey Fierstein, and I could go on. Directed by the great Danny DeVito, and it follows. Robin Williams plays a kids talk show host, something like a Barney or a Blippi, depending on your generation. And he's a kids talk show host named Rainbow Randolph, who gets himself into some legal trouble, to put it mildly, and his time slot is yanked from him, and he's replaced with a Barney-esque figure played by Edward Norton, who the character, it's a rhino named Smoochie, and basically the movie follows Robin Williams is Rainbow Randolph. Boy, that was hard to say. In his path to avenge the loss of his time slot, and that this is a trope that appears throughout the movie. You took my time slot, I want my time slot back. Hilarity ensues. Edward Norton, every time I watch this movie, I cannot believe this is the same person that plays Derek Vineyard in American History X. It really speaks to his acting ability. As I say, directed by Danny DeVito, it was a box office bomb. Actually, it was made on a budget of $50 million. And it grossed only a little over $8 million, I believe.
Steve here again. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like Chris Mowery's Vlogging Through History, and many other great podcasts. Go over to Parthenon Podcast to learn more. And now, here's a quick word from our sponsors. Why do you think that this movie bombed? I would say I watched it more or less when it came out. I may have seen it in the theater even. I'd say it was I would say I want to revisit it a couple of more times. I didn't love it when I first saw it. I'll say that much. Why do you think this movie bombed? That might be a good place to start. Why do you think they bombed at the box office?
Yeah, so there's a subgenre of comedy that you and I would know as black comedies, right? So comedies that will play off dark humor, and think of like the Nightmare on Elm Street 2 onward. All of them have elements of dark comedy to them, for our listeners. It's a very niche sort of genre. It's one that I happen to really like, because I'm brooding and nihilistic. So I really enjoy that particular brand. And I thought Death to Smoochie played that really well. The problem with that is sometimes that's the movie has to find an audience. So I personally think it's because it was shown too much to be a black comedy.
Dark comedies, especially with somebody like Robin Williams, it can be a tough sell when people are expecting a straight comedy with Robin Williams and Danny DeVito, and then you don't get that. It can be a shock to audiences.
Yeah, absolutely. Plus, there's a couple other subplots going on. I guess there's an interesting love triangle dynamic between Smoochie, uh, between Smoochie, Rainbow Randolph, and a woman played by one of my favorite actresses, Catherine Keener.
Yeah, that's a really interesting pick. Let's move on to the next one. I'm gonna go with Death Wish from 1974. I think that this is truly, it could be the most underrated movie of all time, and it's not necessarily because of the box office, because it it was a huge box office success. And if you look at Rotten Tomatoes, it gets maybe C averages, but after this much time, you're talking about a movie from 1974 to get in the 60s in the Rotten Tomatoes. All right. To me, what makes this as an underrated movie is if you took the 1974 Death Wish and just watched it by yourself, you would see it as almost documentary like, of a person breaking down, of somebody whose worldview has crashed down around them. It's the basic story is that Charles Bronson is a architect who's for a lack of a better word, a New York City liberal guy. He would never be the type of person who would have a problem. If we go back to 1974, that New York City was having a terrible crime problem. And Charles Bronson, in his role as Paul Kersey, he had no problem with it. He suddenly does have a problem with it because, well, this isn't too big of a giveaway to the movie, is that his wife is murdered and his daughter has a conflict with these criminals. It's a total random act of violence, and you see just the complete mental breakdown that somebody has after this sort of thing, and he goes and becomes a vigilante. If you watch I firmly believe in it, if you watch this movie by itself, and it's hard to do, but ignore what you know about Charles Bronson, ignore the 4 other Death Wishes, and then the remake that came after it. I love them all, don't get me wrong, but if you watch it by itself, it is a fantastic character case study.
Now that's really interesting. So I think I know where you're going with this, Steve, because very often it's sort of looked at as a fairly basic, straightforward, up the middle, shoot 'em up action movie, which it's not that. But what it really is, if you want to get down, like you say, to the character study, this is a man whose ideological scenery, as it were, is collapsing around him. Because you're dead right. Not only is he a New York liberal, but if memory serves, and I won't lie, it's been a little bit since I've seen the original. He's an especially staunch anti-gun person at the beginning of the movie.
They set him up that he was a conscientious objector in
right.
whichever war was the war. I think it might have been Korea, that he was a conscientious objector. And so he was very pacifistic, but his circumstance changed. And like you said, it's a complete cognitive dissonance. Like his whole worldview collapses around him.
Yeah, it was the conflict was brought to his doorstep. He had no other choice. And incidentally, again, I don't think this will give too much away. But in the conflict scene, let's call it that, you'll find a young Jeff Goldblum in his very first role.
Yeah. And I think that what they really tackle is the brutality of it, the brutality of the crime, the brutality of the city, the brutality of the system that honestly didn't care what happened to him as the victim. They were more concerned about the defense of the criminals. And we see these sort of things play out. It's in a lot of ways a morality play too.
A morality play, and as you point out, they don't care about him. And another thing that you point out just then a minute ago that I wouldn't mind bringing back up is the randomness of the act, and I think the randomness of it was very important. I feel like it wouldn't have been quite the body blow that it was if it was a friend that did the attack. Obviously, you know the movie, so you know that they follow them home from the grocery store.
Yeah.
Right. So I don't think that's too bad of a spoiler.
No.
So yeah, the randomness of it, I think speaks to it. It helps to really sort of lodge the theme in your brain. Great movie. I don't. The rest were fine. I felt like it was sort of like Men in Black 2 syndrome. Well, we're gonna pull the core things that we knew made the first one successful. We're gonna use different names and slap together a sequel, and this will be our cash cow. And there was no real passion or feeling for the art in it. I actually have seen all the Death Wishes, believe it or not, in my day. But yeah, that first one is a classic, no question.
I think what really makes the 1974, the original Death Wish, underrated is that you come into it, and I'm sure the person who was sitting in the theater in 1974 thought this too. They know Charles Bronson. He was an action star, westerns,
Magnificent Seven.
Yeah, war flicks. That's what he did, and that's what you expected out of him coming into that film. And then you pilot on that afterwards. He was in all those same kinds of movies. And then you do, as much as I do love Death Wishes 2 through 5 plus the remake, they are shoot 'em ups.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean,
but this one is a serious drama.
Totally agreed.
Now let's move on. What would you like to talk about next as your next underrated movie?
Golly. Well, I think I'm going to, I have them in my head. I think I'm going to go with Margin Call.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Let's hear it. I love it. Let's go for it.
Yeah. So Margin Call, great movie. The story basically takes place over a 24-hour period at a Wall Street investment bank. And this is during the initial stages of the financial crisis that we both knew and loved from 2008, preceding those events. So what is basically gone through is the actions that are taken by a group of employees before this collapse. It's a great movie. It's directed by a guy named J.C. Chandor. It's his first, it's his directorial debut, which may not sound like a big deal, but the star power in this movie is pretty insane. You got Kevin Spacey. Whatever you want to think about him, he's a great actor. No getting around that. Paul Bettany, Jeremy Irons. I think, in my opinion, he steals the show, and he's basically in one scene, two scenes, I suppose. Zachary Quinto, Simon Baker, Demi Moore, Stanley Tucci, and again, I could go on. It did okay. It did the best on my list. It was made on a $3.5 million budget. I'll chat about that in a second, and it made almost 20 million. So not too bad. But I think a lot of that might have been an actuarial thing from the fact that it was made on such a small budget. Big portion of that is the movie. Two things. Number one, it's set primarily in one setting. About 80% of it takes place within an office building. And then the second was that the movie's dialogue driven. So this is no Death Wish, let me tell you. This is dialogue driven, where it's really left to the actors to be able to build the intensity, build the drama, build that sense of urgency, which I think every single one of them hits out of the park. And it's extraordinary to me because this won't be a great way of selling the movie to our listeners, but about probably 90% of the movie is meetings. Truly. So yeah, like I said, great acting. I would particularly say Kevin Spacey and Jeremy Irons did a phenomenal job as well.
It's difficult to take a movie like that's based on a topic of finance and turn it into something that's really engaging. Why would you put this into the underrated classification?
Yeah, it was kind of funny because I was actually using that line of logic. The fact that how do you take what's something that's boring, something that you don't want to watch a movie about? And I actually was going to say The Big Short by Adam McKay, which deals in similar subject matter, but obviously it approaches it from a different theme. The reason I chose this one is because I had never heard of the movie prior. And as you know, I'm a bit of a movie guy. And this movie is about, I think it's 10 years old. I'm not entirely certain what year it came out, but it's been out for a while. And no one I've talked to seems to know this movie. Now that seems a shame. And I have a feeling a lot of it has to do with A, the subject matter, and B, the way it's presented. So yeah, that's where I'd go with the why I would classify it as an underrated film.
That kind of this is maybe an honorable mention for me, but there's a movie along similar lines. It was an earlier financial crisis, Margin Call, from, I want to say around 2001 ish. It was a movie. It was about boiler rooms. They were the thing in the late 90s where companies would set up phone banks and
dumps.
Yeah, and they would just sell garbage, Class D bonds and stocks to middle income people. And that one, it was kind of like Margin Call, but in the scuzzier end of the business. They all wound up in the same place of bankrupt, but I would give Margin Call an honorable mention.
Do you mean, Steve, you said you'd give Margin Call an honorable mention. Did you mean Boiler Room?
Or Boiler Room. Yeah, I'd give Boiler Room an honorable mention for mine. But people should, maybe that would be a good one to even talk about in the future.
Well, funny enough, that's actually one of my favorite movies also. Yeah, Giovanni Ribisi, Vin Diesel. Yeah, really good acting. Good movie.
Yeah, that one. Let's put that one on the list. For my next one it was a surprise to me because I just recently watched this movie and I just stumbled upon it because I've been doing a little bit of research into the mafia, and I was reading about Joe Gallo, and he was known as Crazy Joe. He was a mobster. He lived and worked in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and he just had an absolutely insane life. He had several movies made about him. One was made during his lifetime, and he was murdered in Little Italy in 1972. The famous Italian spaghetti Western producer, Dino De Laurentiis, made a movie about him, fictionalized version of him called Crazy Joe in 1974, starring Peter Boyle, the dad from Everyone Loves Raymond. And so I saw that this movie, and I never heard of it. If you look at the poster art, it's absolutely crazy poster art. And I was like, I've got to watch this movie. It was incredible that they made a movie it was a fantasy of a person's life who just died. They captured something, even though a lot of the events were highly, highly fictionalized. But what they took was this person who lived a crazy life, Crazy Joe, and they turned it into a fantasy of it, almost a fable of his life. And it was just a caricature. It was almost cartoon-like, but in the very best way. And I've never seen a movie do that. It bended genres. It was a mafia movie. It had dark comedy elements to it. It had blaxploitation elements to it. And the fact it was I've talked to a friend about it, and we did an episode on it. I don't, at this point, it may not have been published yet, but it's almost like an Italian, Dino De Laurentiis, looking at America in early 1970s through an Italian European's lens, and then putting that onto film. It's absolutely an unbelievable film.
Incredible. So genre bending. So that might lead into why it was not picked up as a massive hit. If you had to give it a genre, what would you call it?
I would put it firmly into the mafia genre, because it really does hit all of those points. It talks about a mafia character, and it goes through and it really is, in a way, it's a biopic, but it's a fantasy of a biopic. It's taken event by event. They were events that really happened to Joe Gallo in his life, but they took them and amped them up to 11 to really, I think, draw out the real essence of what his life was, and that his life was, he was bigger than life.
That's amazing. You
know what I would compare it to is putting a filter on somebody. You take a picture and then you use these filters on them. So like, it's still, I take a picture of Josh Cohen and I put a filter on it. It's still Josh Cohen, but it's brought something completely different out of you. And I think that's what this film did, is that it took a real character and a real person and put this fantasy filter on him that just brought out something completely new. It's a movie I think people, especially if you like the mafia genre and you're interested in mafia history, give it a chance. It's because I'm always one of the people with history movies that I'm not looking for something that's historically accurate. I want to see something portrayed on film that brings something new out of a character, and I want to see something different. I don't want to watch a documentary necessarily.
No, same here. I want to watch something that's stylized, that packs a punch. Won't be surprising to listeners familiar with our Quentin Tarantino chats. So why do you think it was? Why would you classify it as underrated then, Steve?
I think because it's a movie that virtually nobody today would ever have heard of. I think if you asked 10 people on the street if they've ever heard of the Crazy Joe movie, they're not going to. And I think even people who were big fans of the mafia genre would not have heard of this movie. And there's really it's very cartoonish, but then you get some great dialogue with the great Eli Wallach.
Yeah.
A young Fred Williamson, and all of these, they're Rip Torn. Henry Winkler is in it, and he plays a really off-the-wall character. I think people may watch this movie and just say, I don't get it. And I completely get that. I didn't get it at first, but then I watched it a couple of times and I'm like, I love this movie. I think it's creeped into maybe my top 10 favorite movies.
And that it's tough to crack your top 10, as I know. So
yeah, for sure.
I wasn't able to convince you on Inglourious Basterds, I don't think. So
I liked it, not quite crack the top 10.
Yeah.
But I definitely liked it. Now, let's move on to your final movie, Bad Times at El Royale.
Yeah. So the last movie I chose, very good movie, also fairly recent. Bad Times at El Royale came out 2018. Just like with Margin Call, it's an ensemble cast. You have the great Jeff Bridges, you have Dakota Johnson, you have Chris Hemsworth, among many others. John Hamm plays, in my opinion, what amounts to a cameo role, but that can certainly be disputed, and I wouldn't have much of an argument in the end of it. But basically, the plot, it's shot in it's a very Tarantinian type of film, though it's not Tarantino. It's written and directed by a guy named Drew Goddard. So the plot centers on 6 strangers and an employee at this hotel called the El Royale, and that's a hotel that's located along the California-Nevada border. And basically, it's a bunch of deep, dark secrets within the hotel, and they basically come to a head during a night in the late 1960s. It's a period film in effect. Really good movie. It explores themes like morality, faith, hero worship, redemption, and there's also it also touches a little bit on political corruption. Now, the reason I feel that the movie is underrated is because it did underperform at the box office. It made $31.9 million against a $32 million budget. So it did not make money. I think that's a real shame. So yeah, it's an ensemble movie, as I said before. So there's no real main character as such, but I particularly enjoy Jeff Bridges' character. He plays a priest with some deep, dark secrets, Put it that way, trying to be mindful that we don't want to give too much away.
Well, this movie tackles a lot of complicated themes. Do you think that could have been part of the reason it didn't hit at the box office?
Yeah, I do think that. And we were talking a little bit ago about like box art and like what the poster says. If you look at the poster, that you can't really glean anything from it, or at least I couldn't. So I think that was part of it. People didn't quite know what they were seeing. I also got that impression when I watched the previews for the movie. And yeah, it does tackle fairly deep themes. One topic that I didn't mention, a minute ago, which I should have, has been the idea of government surveillance. And indeed, the idea of surveillance period is sort of tackled as a issue as well. And also ensemble movies. There's a tendency out there for people to think that these ensemble movies are always massive hits, and they're not, because oftentimes when you have an ensemble type of movie with multiple plot lines, you have you will always run the risk of not focusing on one plot enough, and focusing basically trying to be a jack of all trades with the plot management and mastering none of them. So basically, at the end of the day, you have a movie that tells 6 half stories with no full story being realized. In my opinion, Bad Times at El Royale definitely does not do that. Every storyline is wrapped up in a very unique and intersecting way. And one of the reasons visually that it appealed to me was because, as I mentioned, it does have a Tarantino-esque sort of feel to it. There's a non-linear narrative storytelling in the movie, which is a dead nod to Tarantino. It would have to be. And there's also 1 or 2 trunk camera shots. That is, it's as if we're in the trunk of the car looking up at the person that's just opened the trunk. That's another one of Tarantino's signature shots, which he's done in every movie from Reservoir Dogs onward. Let me see. Yeah, and I think one of the other reasons why it's maybe enough people didn't quite go see it was because of its runtime. Don't have the exact length down, but it runs roughly around 2.5 hours. And I don't know about you, but after 2 hours in the theater, my brain tends to go elsewhere. Tarantino keeps my attention, and Bad Times at El Royale keeps my attention. I frankly would love to see it broken up into a bit of a universe. Tarantino, he did Reservoir Dogs, and he was able to break up that movie into its own universe. Vic Vega from Pulp Fiction Vic Vega from Reservoir Dogs and Vincent Vega from Pulp Fiction are revealed to be brothers, thus establishing them in the same universe. And I'd love to see Gotta do something like that with Bad Times at El Royale, but you know what? We're coming up on 5 years now, so I don't think that's in the cards.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. How would you classify this as an underrated movie if you had to put it into? We've been kind of defining some of these movies as underrated, as some didn't do that well in the box office, some didn't hit the right audience. What do you think? How is this underrated? In what way is it underrated?
Yeah, I mean, I would say outside of the runtime, which I really do think it was a chief point of contention among critics. Was the runtime. It's a movie that not a lot of people know, which is shocking to me considering there's an Avenger in it. But no, a lot of people I talk with on the street, and this is just anecdotal, but when I mention the movie, people don't it doesn't seem to have quite the instant name recognition pop that I would expect it to.
Yeah, for sure. And I think in a way that leads us into the last movie we're going to talk about. And it's to me, it's one of my favorite movies of all time. And I think that it's maybe one of the most underrated movies of all time, at least in my opinion. And that's Copland from 1997. This is a movie I've probably seen 20 times at the very least. I watch it every time it's on. If I see it on streaming, I watch it. And what it really is it's a neo crime noir drama. The big thing that separates this from a lot of other movies in this cop drama procedural action film is that it stars Sylvester Stallone, and Sylvester Stallone had kind of been in a trough in his career for maybe the previous 2 or 3 movies he had been in were kind of flops. There was a gap, and then he comes out with this where it's a straight drama. He put on, I think, about 80 pounds. He has a big gut, and it's a real gut. It's not a fake gut. His face is poofy, and he plays a completely different character. He plays a small town sheriff who's bumbling. He's wears white socks with his black shoes. And the big thing with this movie is, and I think one of the reasons it's underrated, it has it huge cast that Sylvester Stallone, Harvey Keitel, Ray Liotta, Robert De Niro, Peter Berg, Janine Garofalo, Robert Patrick, Michael Rappaport, Annabella Sciorra, and there's some other people. Some of the people where this was one of their first roles. You have other people who are certified stars like Robert De Niro. You have people like Harvey Keitel who are stars in more maybe theatrical movies and more grittier movies, and you put all of them together into this cast, and it's an excellent character study. Every character plays off of each other. They're all connected to one another, and that's really the theme of the movie, is that everything is a conspiracy in the movie because everybody has these dealings behind the facade of this town. And I won't get into too much of it. It's really, this town is set up as it's hard to explain all of it, but basically the setting of the movie is paper. It's a town that's paper thin, that it has a veneer of beauty, but behind it, it's totally corrupt. And the fact that they were able to build all these layers of character, of setting, of theme in a 2-hour movie is unbelievable to me. It did really well at the box office, but I think it's a movie that people really don't talk about anymore.
So now that's interesting. Yeah. So, what makes you want to classify it then as underrated?
I think it's underrated because I think it should be on everybody's top 10 list. I think that it does not get credit for the bending of this crime genre, and it doesn't get the credit that it deserves of the really fantastic way and magical way almost that they tie all these different characters together, and how well it's acted. I think people just kind of get sucked away that, oh, it's a Sylvester Stallone movie, it's a mafia movie, and they don't really appreciate what the directors and the writers, it's the same person, James Mangold, but what he did to create and fully develop and see through an entire universe really in a 2-hour movie. As far as, people want to expect an action movie out of Sylvester Stallone, there's only one action scene at the end of the movie, and it's really anticlimactic, but it absolutely ties together the whole movie.
So that's interesting. So I wonder, because I was going to say this actually about Bad Times at El Royale, and I forgot to. But oftentimes I wonder if a movie's originality can play a role into how it's underrated. Bad Times at El Royale, just to digress for a quick second, a very, very original storyline. You won't find an imitation anywhere of it, right? And Copland too. I won't give anything away to our listeners, but a major plot point of the movie. Well, the movie's called Copland. So for our listeners, the movie's presented to us in a very interesting way. Where I hope this doesn't give too much away, but everyone is a cop, and good or bad. So I wonder if there's the line of morality is somewhat blurred, very original. And I wonder if that could have contributed to people perhaps not remembering it as they should.
Yeah, I think that I definitely agree to you that you're onto something, is that originality, and you're not getting it. Like if you watch a Quentin Tarantino movie, you're going to expect originality, and you're expecting something that's going to bend genres. That's going to have it's going to be a dialogue and a character driven, and there's going to be moral ambiguity. If you're not coming in expecting that, if you're expecting a Sylvester Stallone, Robert De Niro, Ray Liotta, straight action mafia type movie, and you don't get that, you get a lot of moral ambiguity, good cops and bad cops, and good cops who are bad and bad cops who sometimes do good. You're not getting it, especially in 1997 when we lived in a very different, I mean, it's crazy as that sounds, pre 9/11 world. That was a very different world that we live in, and today, just less than 30 years later.
Totally.
One other thing I'll say for this movie, sometimes you watch movies that are even from the mid 90s and they seem very dated. I think this is a movie, if you just ignore some of the cars, it feels like a very modern movie. And I think that it's a movie that you can watch over the years and tap into it in different ways. And I think that's another underappreciated characteristic of this movie.
Yeah, I agree. The ability to make a movie stand on its own throughout the years. Very few movies can do that. I think Office Space is another one. That was one that was released around that time, 1996, I think. That has themes and settings and that transcend both time and place.
What do you think? What are some other things that you noticed with underrated movies? I would definitely say that one thing that screams underrated is a movie that just doesn't do well financially. It means that there weren't eyeballs on it, that it just didn't get seen.
Yeah, when you asked me at the beginning of this, Steve, what do I consider? How do I define underrated movie? I was very tempted to just hang my argument on, well, if it underperforms at the box office, what could be simpler than that? But also, I think as we were talking, movies that tend to blend genre and also blur the lines between drama and comedy. So there's a movie. If we want to talk honorable mentions, there's a movie called Lake Placid, which listeners may know, they might not know. It's about a killer crocodile. And it's Oliver Platt, it's Bill Pullman, and a bunch of other people. And it blurs that line between comedy and horror. I thought it was great. I really liked it because, as I say, that's kind of my wheelhouse. But it couldn't find an audience. So, yeah.
A lot of movies that do that. I think also movies that completely defy expectation, when you come into them and you're really expecting X and they give you not even Z, they're giving you like A with the actors. It could even just be the choice of actors. If that really can, if you get that bad taste in your mouth initially and it hasn't met what you're thinking you're supposed to be getting, it just completely bombs it. You go to the Chinese restaurant and they give you a plate of spaghetti and meatballs with red sauce. You're not getting what you thought you were going to get, even though it could have been the best spaghetti and meatballs you ever had.
So yeah, no, I definitely accept the metaphor or the analogy. So when Sweeney Todd came out, Johnny Depp, Helena Bonham Carter, 2006, does that sound about right?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
I was not aware that it was a musical. And I know I'm not alone because I'd read of other people not knowing it. Now, I feel embarrassed to say that now because it's a very famous Stephen Sondheim musical. But I'm only slightly more cultured now than I was in high school. But the scene opens. The movie, when I'm watching the preview music, there's no singing, there's no nothing. So I think I'm just watching a good, straightforward, drama / horror movie, which, it's Johnny Depp. That's nothing that's not a stretch to think. And he kind of looks like Edward Scissorhands if you go off the hair and face, and it's Tim Burton's film. So why wouldn't that be the case? And then I get there and they immediately start, I have sailed the world, and my jaw is just, hitting the floor. So I couldn't enjoy the movie as perhaps I otherwise could have if I knew I was going into a musical. Now, it's a great movie, and I've now that I'm aware of what it is, I was able to go back and watch it and appreciate the artistic presentation, if that isn't too haughty a term, right? So yeah, agreeing, if there's a disconnect between what you're expecting and what you're getting, it well could be the best plate of spaghetti. But if I wanted chicken wings,
overall though, what do you think how people should view these movies? Because my last word on it is a lot of these movies, for me, a movie that I usually dislike, if I watch it again, I can get something else out of it. And I think that a lot of times with a movie that may be underrated, that people just don't like it that first time, is to maybe watch it again. And that you can come to it with fresh eyes and appreciate it from some different angles. What do you think how people should approach underrated movies?
Yeah, so I don't disagree. There's a bit of a catch-22 built in there somewhere, because if you didn't like it the first time you watched it, you probably wouldn't want to put the effort in or the investment in to watch it a second time. But yeah, approaching underrated movies, I would say I hate to just agree with you, but if you go in with an open mind and don't be me in circa 2006 with Sweeney Todd. And just try and appreciate the art for how it's being presented to you without a preconceived notion of what you think it should be. I think that will go a long way. And also, and this has to be said, it's amazing that we've gone this far without mentioning it, but critics don't know everything. Yeah. I don't think they know even most things, because there have been movies that there was a movie with Adam Driver, and I forget a lot about it because I've purposely tried to forget a lot about it. But he plays basically they have this daughter who's a mannequin, who's a dummy.
I think I have seen that movie.
Yeah, and it is unwatchable as far as I'm concerned. It put me to sleep right away. It just like you know what Mark Twain said about Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of Christian Science?
No.
Chloroform in print. So I think I'd classify that as chloroform on film. Try that again, on chloroform on film. But that was the critics loved that movie. It got like 95% of Rotten Tomatoes by critics. To me, it's absolutely unwatchable. Then you have a movie like Death to Smoochie that gets skewered by the critics. But I and many others, because it has since developed a cult following, somewhat, love the movie. I interviewed just very recently. I interviewed on my other podcast a woman named Janelle Riley, who's a writer for Variety, and she's interviewed Edward Norton and all the big guys, and she's told me one of her favorite movies is Death to Smoochie. So if that enhances its marketability to any people that care what these kinds of people think, writers and critics and so forth, there you have it. Let me ask you this, Steve. Off your list of 4, is there one movie that you would particularly recommend to our listeners if they only were going to watch one?
Well, my recommendation would 100% be Copland. And I want to hear from people out there. What's a movie that you think is extremely underrated that you think maybe Josh and I, both of us, haven't seen? And we'll go ahead and we'll watch these movies and try and appreciate it from your perspective. So I definitely suggest people send in your top underrated movies, and we can revisit them.
Absolutely.
All right, Josh. Well, thank you for coming on again. I know you'll be back on again in the probably not too distant future. So I will talk to you soon.
Sounds great, Steve. Always a pleasure, man. Thank you so much.